Welcome back to MidPoint, and we are following developing news. You are looking now live at a picture outside the Boston, Massachusetts courthouse. Inside that courthouse is where they are now reading the verdict on Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the sole surviving Tsarnaev brother who was involved in the Boston Marathon bombing. Let's just bring you up to speed. In total, there are 30 federal counts that are involved here. There are 17 yes or no decisions that have to be made. 17 of these decisions carry with them the death penalty. We are following what's going on inside the courtroom. We do know that at this point, Tsarnaev has been found guilty on the first 4 counts of the indictment, and the first 3, we understand, all carry the death penalty. So at this point, Tsarnaev has been found guilty of at least 1 count. All you have to do is find the 1 count here, found guilty of it. And of course, this is as expected. This is all interesting because earlier today, former Boston Police Commissioner Edward Davis, this was a gentleman who played a very integral role in the response to the marathon bombings, was quoted as saying that he believed the jury would find Tsarnaev guilty, but he thought it would take a long time. He did not expect this decision to come so quickly. Basically because, again, 30 charges determining whether or not reasonable doubt would exist in each one of them. He thought it was going to be a very long, drawn-out process. They are continuing to read the verdict right now. Let's go live. Let's speak with one of our legal analysts. Heather Hansen joins us now. She's on the telephone live outside of the courtroom. Heather, we're hearing that the first 4 decisions are all guilty. Would you then expect first 5, let me update now, all guilty as they read this? Would you expect that eventually we are going to get to 30 and hear guilty on all?
Ed, I wouldn't have originally said that because a couple of the counts were a little bit more difficult to prove than others, but we've gone past some of those and had guilty verdicts. So, yes, I do think that at this point we will very likely hear guilty on all of the counts.
With regard to a lot of this, in regard to the comments I just read a few minutes ago from Edward Davis, the former Boston Police Commissioner, who thought that this was going to take a long time for them to go over, what does it tell you when you've got a jury looking at 30 different charges and they were able to come to a decision in a relatively short time?
Well, it's not all that surprising in that, as we know, the defense didn't put up a fight here. They did not put on a defense. I think they called all of 4 witnesses. So, you would have expected to see this. The time that it did take, I think, really reflected the extremely complicated nature of the verdict sheet. There was 30-somewhat pages in this verdict sheet that they're now going through, and they had to compare that to the indictment with all of the charges in the case to make sure that they understood the law. So I think that this is an appropriate reflection of the way that the case went in, the strength of the prosecutor's case, and the fact that the defense really did not put on a defense.
Heather, would you agree with those who have said in the last couple of days, because everybody is now starting to turn to whether or not the death penalty will be involved here, and of course it is going to be involved, but whether or not he will be sentenced to death. Some attorneys and some legal experts have said, look, even if he is found guilty on all the charges, even if he is sentenced to death, it will take 20 to 30 years of basic appeals back and forth. He is not going to be put to death anytime soon, and it's very likely that that may play into what the judge will decide and say, the appeals process is going on, let's just sentence him to life in prison.
Well, if the jury comes back with the death penalty, the judge, it would be extremely unlikely for the judge to overrule that. And then the appeal process will start. I absolutely agree that appellate process will go on forever. We know that there are a number of appellate issues for sure, not the least of which is the judge's complete refusal to move this to a different venue. And, that has already been appealed as much as it could be within this trial. And at least one judge dissented with the idea of keeping this case in Boston. So that's something that will go up either way. But, the death penalty part of this case, Ed, is going to in many ways be the longest and the most illuminating. We're going to hear a lot more about Tsarnaev's childhood, what drove him to do this. I think that you're going to hear in many ways the older brother, Tamerlan, on trial. You're going to hear a lot about his influence over his brother and perhaps some insight into where exactly all of this came from and why this happened.
Isn't it fair to say, and before I continue, I want to just point out that we are now told that the first 8 counts he has been found guilty on. And just as a quick idea here, count 6 was conspiracy to bomb a place of public use. That is guilty. Count 5 was involved using a pressure cooker bomb, which basically was one of the 2 bombs that killed the people at the Boston Marathon along the street there. But as we look forward in all this and we look at the way that the defense presented this case, wasn't it the only thing that they could do? The absolute only thing. They had no other choice but to come in here and say that, yes, he's guilty, and yes, it has to be his brother, simply because a dead conspirator makes it much easier to place the blame.
No doubt about it. And I think that Judy Clark is the attorney that you heard most from in this case. She's the one who did the opening and the closing. And she is the same attorney who represented the Unabomber, who represented Susan Smith, that woman who killed her children. She represented Jared Loughner, the man who shot Representative Gabby Giffords, amongst others. She has a reputation of, saving all of these people from the death penalty, and she is brilliant at doing so. So this is all very calculated, not to get him off, but to save his life. And I think that, that is why she did not plead guilty, 1, to save any appeals, but 2, to give the jury the ability to say to Tsarnaev, yes, you are guilty, and they are doing so. I mean, I'm watching the different counts come in, and every single one we're seeing a guilty count. That this jury is speaking very loudly on that issue. And in her closing, the defense attorney asked them, she said, he stands ready to be held responsible by your verdict. I think that her hope is they will hold him responsible with the verdict and perhaps not take his life as well. She's very much against the death penalty, and that is her ultimate goal. This part of it is really just something she had to get through.
Is it possible that when we get down to the sentencing phase, and now we have the first 10 counts that he has been found guilty on, as we follow again, I want to remind everybody that there are no cameras allowed in the courtroom in Massachusetts, so that is why this verdict is being read, and we are then being told on the outside, which is why we are all waiting to hear what happens on the outside. We're told that family members will address the media. That's why Heather's on the outside right now. We have to wait and get this all secondhand. But we have found out that the first 10 verdicts, the first 10 counts, all guilty. The first one I wanted to point out, too, was using a weapon of mass destruction. Heather, that's interesting, because when people think of weapons of mass destruction, we think of something so much bigger. We think of something that takes out hundreds of people, perhaps. Is this, when you look at just that phraseology, weapon of mass destruction, is that something that has always been there, or is it something that, because of what's happened maybe in the last 10 years, that it's now become a line to use and a charge to use?
Well, it's a terrorism count, and the pressure cooker here was most certainly a weapon of mass destruction. We certainly see that type of language used more often now, where we have these homegrown terrorists, the shoe bomber, when that case came up, that also involved weapons of mass destruction. So you will see those counts more often as we see more of these types of cases. Unfortunately, with the homegrown terrorism that we're seeing, those people who just this past week were arrested for trying to join ISIS and create bombs here in the United States. It is a count that, this is a federal case, and under that count, it brings the death penalty. So it is a count that is very important in order to really go after these people and prosecute these cases.
All right, I feel like I'm back doing sports here, because here we are now watching as things go by, and we're being told as verdicts come in, we're now told that the first 12 are guilty, and again, they are all being read individually, so we're almost creating a scoreboard here. It is 12-0 guilty here, and we have 18 more to go, and I would expect that they're all going to wind up guilty, but we're going to stay right here and stay with this as they continue to give us these decisions. With regard to the death phase now, and knowing full well that Judy Clark has kept Dzhokhar Tsarnaev off the stand at this point, do you think that it's likely, because she is trying to draw sympathy out of this audience, basically saying that it was his brother, it wasn't him, he's just a kid, he didn't know what he was doing? Of course, we don't see that in any of the verdicts here. But do you think it would be possible and or smart if she then put him on the stand during the penalty phase and tried to gather that sympathy?
It is definitely possible. Smart depends in great part as to what he would say, and we just don't know that, Ed. There is a strong possibility that he wants to be a martyr here. We don't know what he wants to plead. We don't know whether or not he wants the death penalty. She represented the Unabomber. The Unabomber did not want to use an insanity defense, which was her plan. And to make a very long story short, he ultimately pled guilty rather than use an insanity defense with her. She didn't care because her only goal was to save his life. We don't know what Tsarnaev would say. We don't know whether he would say, yes, I did it and I want to die and that was my plan all along. So, that is a lot of that decision making is going to be pursuant to her conversations with him. What I do think she's hoping, and you will hear if it's at all possible, is some family member to humanize him and to testify to, the type of person he was.
Isn't there a danger, though? Isn't there a danger, though, if you do that, if you put a member of the family on the stand, because certainly they're going to be very emotional, and as much as you try and you prepare people for this and you have them ready, that even if you're the defense, you're not quite sure that if they say one word wrong, one thing about the kid's upbringing, or the young man's upbringing, we should say, he's no kid, but anything in there, that creates an instant slip and you lose right there.
Yes, that is the case, and that's the chance you take. What I anticipate, and again, you don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but what I anticipate, and that will be extremely interesting as far as getting some answers here, I anticipate that in many ways they're going to put the older brother Tamerlan on trial. They're going to go into his background. Which is basically
what they've done at this point in the early part of the trial, correct? They have been indicating that. So that has been their strategy all along, yes?
Yes, and their hands were tied in great part by the judge in the first part of the trial because that is not relevant to whether or not he is guilty. She certainly tried in many ways to get it in, but you're going to hear a lot more of that in the next stage of the trial. We haven't heard anything about or from Tamerlan's wife. You'll remember that she lived with them, and you would think she'd have some insight into what happened here. It'll be interesting to see whether she is called by either the prosecution or the defense in the next stage. I anticipate that the next stage of the trial will be as long as this stage was, and in many ways far more enlightening.
Heather, we now hear that the first 15 counts, and again, we want to remind everybody that there are 30 total counts here. 17 are basic yes or no questions. 17 carry the death penalty. The first 15 he has all been found guilty of, and the first 3 were all death penalty issues. So we are continuing to get the reading here from the courthouse in Boston. Heather, I'm going to ask you an opinion question here, if you don't mind, because I lived in Boston. I was very fortunate to be there for several years. Know a lot of the people, know the areas where this happened, was around the marathon at times, and I feel for the people up there because I have a personal connection to many people there. Most of the friends that I have in Boston over those years are all liberals. They're all very Democratic. They're all very left. These are people who, on the whole, will absolutely tell you, I disagree with the death penalty completely. However, I can tell you that a number of them I've spoken to, the majority, and these are all people mostly in their 30s to 50s, have told me that, and as one individual put it, I would hold the gun to his head, I would stand at Boston Common, and I would execute him willingly and happily if this happened, no matter how I feel about the death penalty. The people that you've talked to, the people that you hear, and the different attorneys, are you getting any sense then that there are people there in Boston who don't want the death penalty to happen because of how they feel, or even the slightest inkling of how they feel, because this is a big issue with their conscience as well?
Yeah, I think that I too am from Boston. I grew up in Foxborough where the Patriots play, and we used to go to the marathon every year. And I think that people there are torn. I think you hear a lot of people who would never otherwise be for the death penalty are in support of it in this case. And it is a case where even those who tend to lean against the death penalty say, if you're ever going to use it, this is the case, where you have video of him putting a backpack full of explosives behind a child. If you're ever going to use it, this is the case. You also hear from people who think that he'd be better off put him in jail and never hear from him again, especially if it is true that he wants to be a martyr. Why give him that satisfaction? So there continues to be a wide range of emotion on this issue, and the death penalty issue in general, and on this particular case. I do think, if the death penalty is given against him, you're going to see many, many years of appeals and a very long time before that happens. And for some people, that impacts their decision-making on this as well.
By the way, I do want to point this out, too, and we've been getting a lot of tweets. I've been getting personal tweets, but at MidPoint TV. And I also, guys, if you do me a favor, if you could, just get us up to Facebook one more time because I don't have it right here in front of me. But I would like to hear if there are people watching us who grew up in the Boston area, grew up in New England, live there still, because this comes down to many people who live in that area. Massachusetts is a state that really has never really been in favor of a death penalty. Personally, I would love to hear from these people. There's our Facebook. If you go to facebook.com/MidPoint TV, or if you use our Twitter at MidPoint TV, I would like to hear from you. We would like to hear from you. Could you then, as an individual who lives, and if you're in Massachusetts, this is what we really want to push forward, because this comes down to many people who live there, grew up there, know the people. There's a lot of connections with the people there at the marathon. Could you then, in all good conscience, convict this man of the death penalty, sentence him to death, and be not happy about it, but be content that that is what you had done? So again, it's facebook.com. Go to Facebook. It's MidPoint TV. Give us your comments there, or go to at MidPoint TV. Let us hear your tweets. We may not get to a lot of them today, but come tomorrow, I would really be interested to see how many people in Massachusetts feel that even though there's an inkling against the death penalty, and not just an inkling, a strong feeling by many people, if indeed in this case you could, in all good conscience, vote for the death penalty. We're continuing to get updates here. Heather, we now hear that the first 17 counts he has been found guilty. All right, here's 18, 19, and 20. So we now have the first 20 counts he has all been found guilty on. Counts 16 and 17 dealt with the police officer that was killed. So we're counting down to 30 at this point. What do we expect, Heather, because I know you're there. There's the scene outside the courtroom.
No, I'm not there. I'm not
okay,
there.
You're not. I'm sorry.
I don't want to mislead you. No, I'm in a court in Philly.
Our mistake. Our mistake. I thought that you were at the courthouse. I apologize.
I wish,
but
no.
when we hear people and when we see that scene outside the courthouse, there obviously are going to be state officials come out. The defense attorneys will come out. The families will likely come out as well. What would you guess? And again, we're all just supposing here. That's what we do in television, everybody. It's all time to just guess as to what's coming up. And number 21 is guilty now, I hear. Yeah. What do you think the defense would say as they would come out, if indeed they are found guilty on all 30 counts, what that public statement might be?
I don't know that you'll hear much. Judy Clark is not known for giving a lot of press. She tends to avoid it at all costs. If you hear from them at all, I think it will be something similar to what you heard from her in her closing, which is some language that says, you know, we appreciate that this jury has held him responsible with their verdict. I think that the underscore there is that by doing so, they don't have to then hold him responsible by taking his life. And I think that, you know, again, she said a couple things a couple of times in her closing. The time is now to hold him responsible. His actions deserve to be condemned. And he stands ready to be held responsible by your verdict. I think the hope is to allow this jury to have that sense that they have held him responsible with the verdict, and then perhaps at least one of them won't feel it necessary to hold him responsible with his life.
Okay, Heather, hang on if you will. Now 23 counts. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev has been found guilty by a jury. Heather, if you will, please stand by. We're going to take a break. We are also live in Boston waiting for the reaction to this. The Boston Marathon trial finally coming to an end in the first phase. We'll continue our live coverage right after this. The Look is live in Boston, Massachusetts. This is outside the courthouse. Inside, they are reading the verdict on Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, at last count. 27. There are 30 counts. 27 counts he has been found guilty on. All 17 that carry the death penalty he has been found guilty on. Count 28. And again, they are reading this inside the courtroom. No cameras in the courtroom, so that's why we and everybody else are on the outside at this point, simply getting this as this comes through. Count number 28, he has been found guilty on. Let's see if we can recap some of the counts here, just so you understand what we're talking about here. Because the first 3 counts all carried the death penalty. Those were very quick. As long as one is in there, that's it. The death penalty has been decided. We will then move to the death penalty phase. Counts 16 and 17 dealt with the police officer that was killed at the time, found guilty of those. So they are now taking care of many of the counts that involve weapons of mass destruction, conspiracy, and others. Let's once again bring in via the telephone Heather Hansen, who is our legal analyst here, helping us follow this. 29 is also guilty. Heather, we are just one away. And again, I hate to make this seem like it's a competition, if you will, here, because as we're counting this down, but it really is the way I think there's a lot of people around the country right now that are waiting for this, that want this to be unanimous, simply because of the destruction that it caused and the number of people that were so brutally damaged, brutally injured, and killed. Heather, I believe that when the defense had to sit and watch, and so did others, when the prosecution played a number of the pictures and the videos back in the last stage of this before it was turned over to the jury, I saw some of those pictures. I have seen many of those pictures that have not been made public, and I cannot see how anybody could not be affected by them. It was a closing where simply it drilled everything home perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, the way that the prosecution started the case by calling some of the most emotionally touching witnesses first, they really did a wonderful job in making this case presentable and understandable, and really touched the hearts of the jurors from the very start. And an important point, Ed, you talked about the different counts and how all 30 are important to get guilty verdicts on. We saw with the Whitey Bulger case where some of the counts he was found not guilty on. And for the family members whose families were victims in those counts, there's certainly a lack of closure if you are the one where there's a not guilty. So I think that for the family members of the three who died as a result of this person's heinous acts, it is important to have guilty verdicts on those counts, and I'm happy for them that happened.
Well, since we've been talking here, the final word is in. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is unanimous. It is unanimously guilty on all 30 of the federal counts. We are now waiting for folks to step outside of the courtroom. Again, Heather, I don't think it's a shock at all that they found him guilty on all. Well, let me back up just a second, Heather, because we say that it's not really a shock. But as you looked at all of these counts, were there ones that struck you or that stood out to you that just maybe the defense might have been able to make some sort of a case, or as you look at it, was it all, in your mind, just a fait accompli?
I absolutely thought that there were some counts that the defense, not that the defense really made a case, but the jury came back with questions yesterday afternoon that certainly made me think that there were a couple of counts that they weren't sure on. For example, the bomb that was placed near Crystal Campbell, one of the young ladies who died, was placed by the brother. And so arguably there could be a not guilty count with regard to that bomb. There was a charge of aiding and abetting and a charge of conspiracy there. And the jury came back with questions for the definitions of those two terms. So those charges arguably could have been not guilties. There's another, and it gets into the esoterics of the law, but there was another count that had to do with the death of someone who is not an American. And again, while one of the people who died was not American, that bomb was planted by the brother. So there were some of the counts that you could see a not guilty and you could understand it. But I think that this verdict, unanimous guilty on every single count, is a real coup for the prosecution. And, the defense has a lot of work to do with their mitigation specialists to see what they can do in the coming weeks.
I want to remind everybody once again that we talked about this a little while ago. And those of you who are watching us in Massachusetts or who grew up or live in Massachusetts, but let's even take it a step further than that, because certainly the people in Massachusetts are the ones now. The jury there is going to have to make a decision on whether or not to sentence Dzhokhar Tsarnaev to death. And again, we want to point out 17 charges carried the death penalty. As someone who lived in Boston for a few years, who still has a great affinity for the people there, I'm in love with that area and have so many great friends there. This is a question that I and that we want to ask you, and we want to give you a chance on social media here. Could you pull the switch? I mean, it's just that simple. It doesn't make a difference how you feel about this, because I understand there are a number of people, certainly in Massachusetts and in New England, who do not feel comfortable at all with the death penalty. But in light of what happened here, in light of the fact that we are looking at guilty on all 30 counts in the Boston Marathon bombing trial, and I personally am going to go back for a moment to the pain that I felt on that day, seeing those streets run red with blood, that I had walked and that I knew those shops and knew the people who had gathered there, not knowing anybody personally who was involved, but just being connected, that old 6 degrees of separation. What I felt that day. Would you pull the switch could you inject this man? Could you then be the person to carry out the death penalty? I'm curious. We are curious. Go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/MidPoint TV. Tell us why you could. Tell us why you could not. Also, on Twitter, @MidPoint TV. Send us the tweet. Tell us why. Tell us why you could or you couldn't, because this is such an emotional issue with so many people that are involved. And even if you didn't know one of the people involved personally, there are so many other people that you do know, that many of us know, that we're all connected to it in that area. So this is something that we want to keep pushing. Let's keep pushing that all day, guys, if we can. Let's keep that graphic up as much as we can to keep pushing to people. MidPoint on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/MidPoint TV, or then send us a tweet at @MidPoint TV and tell us that. All right, Heather, we're still waiting now because we are live outside the Boston courthouse. We are still waiting. This same jury now, Heather, is the one that is going to determine the penalty. Same ones now. Looking at how quick this came in, because as we pointed out at the beginning of this hour, there were some people, including, and I want to make sure I get this right, the former Boston Police Commissioner Edward Davis. He was involved in the investigation. He said this is going to take time. This is 30 counts. But the fact it came in very quickly here with the same jury, what would be your expectations now if you are the defense and prosecution going in and then making the case to the same jury, knowing that you've gone over a lot of the evil and the destruction already in the basic first phase of the trial?
Well, the prosecution has done that. I mean, Ed, this is going to be the defense's time to do what they can. We haven't heard anything from them. We really haven't. And I think that it's impossible. People have been opining and talking about whether or not he's going to get the death penalty. It is impossible to say until we've heard what the defense is going to present as mitigating evidence, because you don't know what type of thing they may say, which may tug at the heartstrings of at least one of these jurors. What I do have to point out, though, is this jury, talk about doing your civil service. They have listened to the most horrific evidence, seen horrible pictures. They've now come back with a verdict, and the judge, I just saw the judge has dismissed them for the day, told them that they may come back again at the beginning of next week for the penalty phase, and they're still not allowed to talk about it. They're not even supposed to really talk to their families about it. It is an enormous, enormous thing to ask of these people over such a long time, and it makes me proud of our system and the way that it works to see that there are people who are willing to do it.
I have to tell you that just a couple of moments ago, as you were talking, we've been looking at some of the video here and some of the pictures from the day of the Boston Marathon as we sit and wait for the folks to come out and talk after this verdict. And I was looking at the finish line, because many of us have already seen this video, but I have not seen it for quite some time. And I was there, and as someone, again, who lived there, as a journalist, someone who's been involved in this, in covering it, I was transfixed, if you will, Heather, on the point I knew where the bomb was going to explode. And when I just saw this a few moments ago, I winced. I had to pull back just a little bit, because it was the enormity of what went on there, and it was knowing full well that in a few seconds I was going to witness the moment when people died. Someone had walked away and placed a bomb. A young child was there who lost his life, and they say that he was eviscerated, that he was pretty much blown to pieces. And for somebody who's been doing this for a long time, it stopped me and made me really just think for a second or two. We're working on emotion right now, and everybody is, and this is going to re-energize that emotional tack from the people that are involved, from the citizens, from law enforcement, from the jury, from everybody here. How much does that then play? What is, I guess, the defense going to do to dig into this jury emotionally? We talked, and you mentioned that they might bring the family up, but they've got to humanize him. How do you humanize a guy who was part of a plan that blew somebody to pieces?
Well, you've got to, how do you humanize a woman who put her children in the car and let the car drive into a lake? Mm-hmm. Judy Clark was able to do that with Susan Smith. There are aspects, Judy Clark has been known to say that no one should be judged on the worst day of their life. So what she tries, and the other thing that she said, there's a very, I mean, for what it's worth, there's a piece on her in Vanity Fair, a recent piece, that really gets into how she defends these cases. And she talks about she's not looking for forgiveness, she's looking for understanding. So she has been spending all of this time with him, trying to delve into his childhood and what made him who he is, and his parents and his brother. And, we may hear that his brother abused him. I'm not saying that that's the case, but those are the types of things that she and the rest of the defense team are going to use to try to lead at least one juror to say that he should not die for what he did that one day.
Well, let's point that out again, Heather, because we talk about this. We're unanimous on all 30 counts. He's been found guilty. But it only takes one person to come out and say no, and that ends it all right there. So all you really need, and again, I'm not trying to minimize any of this, but as a defense attorney, your job is difficult enough, but you really only need to find one. And we all know that there's that voir dire process where basically at the beginning of the trial, you're figuring everybody out, you're learning about them. You have your psychological examinations that you're able to do. You have psychologists working for you, any number of people who read juries. So isn't it fair to say that right now at this point, Judy Clark's pretty smart. She already knows who the 1, 2, or 3 people are on that jury, thanks to her consultants, thanks to the trial, thanks to everybody who watches, who might be susceptible to being that one person who would hold out. And as a pretty smart defense attorney, she's going to go after that person, going to work on them, yes?
Yes. I mean, listen, she certainly has in mind, they say with the death penalty cases, the most important part is jury selection. And that is absolutely the case. She certainly has in mind who she wants to focus her arguments towards, but it may differ with regard to different things. You look at, in any case, you look at a juror's background, you look at all the information you have on with regards to their personal life, and then you try to personalize your case to them. So different aspects of Tsarnaev's life may actually impact where she goes and who she focuses upon when she's arguing this case. There's a lot we still need to know about him. As much as there was some evidence about the brother's influence during the guilt phase, you're going to see a ton more of that, and much, much more that we can't even anticipate in the penalty phase.
Okay, so a reminder again, and again, we are waiting outside. We have a live picture outside the courthouse in Boston, Massachusetts. That is where the microphones are set up. That's where we expect to find the lawyers. There you see it right there. There is security there as well. Inside those doors is where the courthouse is, and that's where, emerging from there, when the judge basically sets everything down, finishes up with a lot of the procedurals, they will come out of there. It will be the attorneys, likely the families will also be involved. So we are waiting on this as well. All 30 counts guilty, 17 that carry the death penalty, all guilty there as well. Some of the charges that we have involved here: conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. That is the penalty. That is a penalty of death right there. Using a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. Aiding and abetting. That is also a charge that carries a penalty of death. Using or carrying a weapon in relation to a crime of violence. Conspiracy to bomb a public place. Bombing a public place. Conspiracy to maliciously destroy property, malicious destruction of property by means of an explosive, use or possession of a gun in relation to a crime of violence. Heather, there's a lot of charges here, and if you hear people who are not real legalese or legal eagles, attorneys, and look at this, there's a lot of the same language in all of these conspiracies, using or carrying. But they need to do this, don't they? They've got to be very specific as they go through them, and while they may seem similar in language, they all deal with a very specific part that creates the entire case.
That's correct, Ed, and it has to do with each victim. And that's why I pointed out, with the Whitey Bulger case, for the family of that particular victim, that count is everything. And so that's something that, that kind of gets lost in this. If you're a family member of one of the victims, you're listening to the count that most impacts you. And so each and every one of these is important. Somebody had asked while we were waiting for the verdict on one of the TV stations, well, once they read the one death penalty charge guilty, why do we have to hear any more? which is, you can understand why that question. He's getting going to be up for the death penalty. But the reason you have to is because legal reasons, but also to ensure that those who are victims of his crimes get to hear whether or not he's been found guilty of those crimes.
We are looking right now at some of the pictures, and these are the pictures of those who died in 2013. Christy Campbell, Martin Richard, Lingzi Liu, Sean Collier, the officer who was killed when Dzhokhar and his brother were trying to get away. And there is the young man, the picture that is pretty much burned into the minds of so many people around the world, the young man who we saw standing actually at the side of the Boston Marathon route, the young man who had so much promise ahead of his life, the one whom doctors later said that there wasn't much left after the bomb had exploded. So we are waiting again for the courtroom live. Apparently, we're now hearing word that Dzhokhar Tsarnaev stood with his head bowed, his hands clasped as the guilty verdicts were read on all counts. He pretty much had nothing to say, which of course is exactly what we expected. Now, Heather, a couple of minutes that we have left. And again, Heather, I want to thank you so much. You have been wonderful in staying with us. I know that you're at your offices today in Philadelphia. You always give us spot-on legal advice, and you've been so wonderful to stay here with us as we've been waiting through this hour. So our thanks, and the listeners, viewers, thanks to you as well. As we go through this right now, it would appear again, and I guess we're getting that the penalty phase, does it begin immediately? Will they take a couple of days? Have we had any sort of indication when that starts?
Yeah, the judge has said that they're not going to be in court Thursday or Friday. So at the very earliest, it would be early next week. They will do it relatively quickly because, these jurors are giving up their lives to be there. And not just the 12 jurors who went in and came to this verdict. The alternates have to continue to come as well. So there's 6 alternates, if I remember correctly, in this case, who will also be there every day until the entire case is over.
How long would you guess that a death penalty phase like this would last? I mean, on an average, what are we looking at here? A couple of days? Because it certainly can't take very long, can it?
Oh, gosh. I mean, it certainly could. If the defense is going to put on a long and drawn-out defense of this case, it could take as long as the guilt phase took. We have no idea what types of witnesses Judy intends to call. I think that in an attempt to save his life, you're going to hear a lot of evidence from the defense in this case.
So we are once again waiting to find. I tell you what, we're going to go ahead and we're going to just sort of bring things down to a head here because Steve Malzberg is going to follow us here in a couple of minutes, and he's going to continue the coverage. Heather, we are still waiting, but I'm going to go ahead and let you go if you don't mind because we've only got a couple of minutes.
I'm going to run anyway.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please,
No,
you're so
totally
nice.
fine.
Listen, tell us if you got to run because you're the expert, and we want to keep you as long as we can. Thank you so much for joining us, Heather. We'll talk to you again very soon. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure, and thank you. Have a
All
good
right,
day.
take care. Heather Hansen joins us from Philadelphia. She's been sitting on the line with us here for an hour as we have waited. The verdict was supposed to be read at about 1:45. It came a little bit after 2 o'clock when they started to get into everything here. So Heather's been nice enough to stay with us. So let us recap because in a couple of minutes we're going to kick this over to a break, and then Steve Malzberg is going to come back and join us, and they will continue to follow this as we wait to get some sort of reaction from outside the Boston courthouse, if you will. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the remaining brother, the Boston Marathon bomber, has been found guilty on all 30 federal counts. 17 of them carried the death penalty. So obviously, the death penalty counts. It only took one. And on the very first guilty, that was a weapon of mass destruction. That carried with it the death penalty. So the death penalty phase will begin no earlier than Monday, according to the judge. And it will now be up to this jury to decide if Dzhokhar Tsarnaev lives or dies. But the one thing that I think we do need to point out is it is very likely that if indeed he is found to be eligible for the death penalty, if they do sentence him to death, we're going to be in for a lot of years of appeals. This isn't going to happen right away. It will take some time. Once again, let me ask, and before we leave, I have been asking the people, many of the people who live in Massachusetts, who grew up in New England, who still live there, but anybody, let us know if you could pull the switch. That's the simple question. The death penalty is there. Could you be the one, could you with all good conscience basically put this man to death? Tell us. Go to facebook.com. There you see it, the graphic. Facebook.com/MidPoint TV. Tell us why you could or tell us why you couldn't. Plus, also, go to the Twitter feed. Go to @MidPoint TV. And we're starting to get those in now. Tell us if indeed you could pull the switch on this man. To my home, my former home, the people in Boston, the nightmare is not over yet. We have further to go, but it is a strong people. It has been since that moment, Boston strong, and it will stay that way for the people there and across America as we watch what happens here. I thank our control room crew. They've been marvelous here for the past hour, making sure that we stayed on live and we got all these shots, the people here in the control room as well, and in the studio floor. Rock on, true believers. I'm Ed Berliner. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow right back here on MidPoint.